What are the biggest positions of need ahead of the 2025 free agency period? We're going to talk about that this week on the Wandering Buffalo podcast. Get your hands on stylish t-shirts, hoodies, and more at wearbuff.com. That's wearbuff.com. And make sure to use the promo code TWB at checkout for 20% off your first order. Stay Buffalo proud with Wear Buff.
You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your host, Justin Goddard.
Bills Mafia, welcome into another episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast, a show on the Buffalo FamBase podcast network. My name is Justin, and I am your host. And this week, we are talking about two of the position groups that I think are the Bills' current biggest needs. And that is going to be defensive tackle and defensive end. And this is a position group that it's kind of frustrating because we've seen the Bills sink a lot of assets into trying to get this right. And it's not always the huge names. It's a lot of rotating players. We've tried, the veteran route. We've tried, drafting, whether it was Epinesa, Boogie Basham, Groot. We even did the huge free agent swing with Von Miller. Mixed results there. And this is just a position. These are both position groups that, despite all of those efforts, I feel like it's still the biggest area of need on this team. And, we even saw another investment in the defensive tackle position last year in Dwayne Carter. So, as much as I can sit here and say, wide receiver is a big need, and as much fun as it is to get one of those skill guys on draft night and all that, if I'm the Bills brass, I have a hard time not feeling like I need to go after defensive tackle. I need to go after defensive end in the draft as it stands now. The qualifier on everything that I've talked about in the past and going forward, as we're looking towards the draft, as you may know, free agency is starting this coming Monday. The legal tampering period, air quotes, is starting next Monday. And every opinion I could have had on the last 5 episodes could end up being wrong. And I think one of the things that Brandon Beane does an excellent job of is at least filling holes before the draft. And it may not be, you think we need a starting edge opposite of Groot, and they bring in a rotation guy. It may not be the exact long-term fix, but typically Brandon Beane doesn't go into the draft with huge glaring needs. And the one example that really comes to mind is obviously, the year that we drafted Kyer Elam. It was obvious to us and everybody else in the league that the Bills were probably targeting cornerback early. I think they had their sights set on McDuffie. They got jumped for that and took Elam, and here we are 4 years later. We'll see. I guess Elam's still young. He's probably going to get a chance to compete, and we'll see what happens. But I digress. For the most part, Brandon Beane goes into the draft, and with free agency before the draft, he's usually doing a pretty good job of plugging holes. That combined with the Bills having a more reasonable cap than we've seen in recent years, and yet still not ideal. I think we're currently sitting like minus 10 million, but we do a couple of restructures and you pull some levers, and you, depending on how crazy you want to go with it, they can get to 50, 60, 70 million dollars in cap space. So it's not one of these off seasons where Brandon Beane is like exclusively shopping in the bargain bin. There's some names in the trade market that don't usually, that type of caliber player doesn't usually come free. And there's just lots of opportunities between now and when the Bills are playing their first game for Brandon Beane to address these things. There's the first wave of free agency. We got the draft. We have, the later on free agency. As we get to some of these, post June 1st cuts, training camp starts, players shake free left and right. And, we're already starting to see it across the league with some pretty big names being moved. And the one in particular that came up today, Tyler Lockett, got released by the Seahawks. Subsequently, DK Metcalf requested a trade. One to keep your eyeballs on. Max Crosby, one of my dream targets, gets the biggest non-quarterback deal in NFL history with the Raiders. So good for him, but he would have looked better in Buffalo. So we're going to get into it, starting with the defensive tackles and just starting out what we have going into the 2025 season. So currently under contract, Ed Oliver, Daquan Jones, Dwayne Carter, Branson Dean, and Zion Logue. And the last two there, kind of practice squad guys last year. Zion Logue added during the season. Branson Dean more than Zion Logue. I saw, a couple little flashes of maybe this guy could stick around and be a rotation player. But those two aren't going to be affecting kind of, the starters, the top end of the depth chart here. And at the top of the depth chart, number one, Ed Oliver. And I have kind of a mixed bag with Ed Oliver. I do think that he is a very good defensive tackle. But what we haven't seen from him is kind of just being able to individually wreck a game on his own. And that's not, this isn't me like here slandering Ed Oliver. I think he's a very good player, and those guys that can, destroy an offensive game plan by themselves are super rare in the league. But what we have seen is Ed Oliver be super impactful, super disruptive with somebody playing well next to him. And that's the Ed Oliver I want to see. And we saw that, 2 years ago with him and Daquan Jones just both playing at a super high level. And obviously, Jones kind of went through the injuries there, got brought back as one of the aging players, and an offseason that the team kind of showed a concerted effort to get younger, to get cheaper. Kind of the exception to that was Daquan Jones. And honestly, I was super hyped that they brought him back because he was playing at an incredible level. And, this past season, it just, the play wasn't quite the same. And this isn't like let's cut Daquan Jones. I think he's still a good rotation piece. I don't think it makes much sense contract-wise to move on from him. But I would like to see an addition that, could platoon with Daquan Jones. Maybe a rookie that could, learn from Daquan Jones, maybe eventually take over that starting job. I think this is a position that we've, going all the way back to Star Lotulelei, playing it next to Ed Oliver, and how much better Ed Oliver was when Star was there and healthy, and how much that helped the linebackers, and kind of like the whole defense getting better when they had good play there. And then, Star kind of ages out, injuries, blah, blah, blah. Daquan Jones, kind of a similar theme going on here. So I would love to see a meaningful investment here, whether that's, first, second round pick, something like that. And it's what I would love to see in the first round. But that's easy to do on paper and on mock drafts and stuff. You don't really know how it's going to fall. I don't want them taking, you know, their eighth best defensive tackle because everybody else went, but Justin over there in Rochester wanted us to take a defensive tackle in the first round. It has to make sense. But it is a position that I would like to see them dump some assets into. And that kind of goes back to last year's draft. With the trade back with the Chiefs, we pick up, the extra third round pick and drafted Dwayne Carter there. And he's only going into his second year. There could be, a nice little glow up for Dwayne Carter. But he didn't do anything last year that, absolutely blew my socks off, that made me feel like, okay, year two, this is our dude. And this is one of those things where I'm don't get the privilege of being in the building. Maybe it's something that they feel real good that he's about to turn a corner. But I'm not going into this 2025 season with my plan at defensive tackle is hoping that Dwayne Carter, really steps up and becomes an impact player. Great if he does, but I'm making more investments in the position. And like I said, we have free agency coming up. We have, a trade could get swung. We have the draft. Plenty of time between now and the season starting to make a meaningful addition there. And then just kind of rounding out the group of the other guys that were on the roster last year. And we had Jordan Phillips, Quentin Jefferson, Austin Johnson, who was a pretty big free agent signing considering, contracts that we gave out, and Eli Anku. And that's a group of guys that just kind of doesn't blow me away. We got some aging guys in there. We have dudes that have been rotation players. And look, I'm not opposed to bringing one of these guys back, maybe a couple of these guys back in like a practice squad role, break glass in case of emergency type players. I know Jordan Phillips has been very vocal about, Buffalo being home, not wanting to play anywhere else. If he's playing anywhere, it's going to be Buffalo. Like that's awesome. And I would approach Jordan Phillips and be like, hey, we'd love to have you around on the practice squad. And, we know what you bring to the team. We know what you bring to the locker room. Loved by a lot of guys. Sure. Bring him back. But I don't need to see Jordan Phillips, taking 30% of the snaps on defense. Very, very similar feelings towards Quentin Jefferson. He was brought back in mid-season last year. Not a ton of impact. Austin Johnson was, a little bit of a disappointing free agent signing for me. And the crazy stat line of having 2 interceptions this year, which is absolutely bonkers. But, outside of that, not a huge impact. And actually, down the stretch when we're bringing guys up from the practice squad, Eli Anku seemed to, end up being a casualty again. And he's made a whole career basically of being on and off the Bills practice squad. And he's a dude that I would love to see get a little bit more run. I think he's earned it to an extent. Again, I don't think he's any sort of long-term, top tier factor to fix this room. But, of all those guys that I just listed that are free agents, he's probably my number one that I would want back on the practice squad and, given some form of chance to compete. I think he's been pretty solid every time he's been called into action for the Bills. And hey, if that looks like him returning for practice squad spot again and he's down to do that, sign me up. I'll keep Anku around as long as he wants to be part of the organization. transitioning over to the defensive end room, and the guy's currently under contract. Obviously, Groot, Javon Solomon, 5th-round pick last year, Epinesa, and Von Miller as of now. And Groot, I just kind of need more of the same from Groot. I think he's a very good player that kind of gets a little slept on because he doesn't have the crazy double-digit sack numbers, but he's awesome in run defense. He does get pressures. He is disruptive, and I think kind of the biggest disservice to Groot is, who's playing opposite him, and even to an extent, the defensive tackle is playing next to him as well. And I think it's easier for offenses to plan around Groot and kind of minimize him with the rest of this group of guys that we have here. AJ Epinesa kind of got the bump to more of a starting role last year, and I don't think that went super well. I am a fan of AJ Epinesa. I like him better as like a defensive end 3. Kind of make the most of his reps. I don't need him to do a ton in run defense. I kind of want him to be a long and late downs, come in. He's great at batting passes. I just think this was kind of like be it because of cap, other factors. Maybe they just thought he was ready. This feels to me kind of like the Gabe Davis over promotion of like, yeah, we liked what we saw out of you in your limited snaps. Let's give you more and just hope it trends up. And historically speaking, when given a bigger sample size, it usually tends to shrink back down, get closer to like the average. So I don't think Epinesa took a huge step forward. I don't think he's not somebody, I got my pitchfork out and I need him to go. I think he's a good rotation player. Would we like more out of him as a second round pick? I'm sure. That being said, we kind of know who he is, and he's a serviceable rotation player for us, and that's fine. Javon Solomon, draft pick last year, and we didn't see a lot of him, right? He got, some snaps in late game blowouts, and some situational. We didn't see much from him, and I will say that I think there was opportunity in this edge group for him to have gotten a little bit more on the game reps last year. So I mean, as a fan, that's easy to say, like, hey, our defensive line isn't knocking anybody's socks off. Like, let's just plug in the rookie. Again, I don't get to see what everything looks like in the building every day. Maybe they don't think he's ready. I liked what I saw out of him in the limited reps. And that's going to bring us into the last guy, Von Miller. And, at a certain point, do we just see, what the young man had over Von last year? I'm not sure about that. I think Von had simultaneously a better season than he's given credit for, while also kind of being a disappointment. And that comes with, the price tag of and what we brought him in to do. And, that game record, the game finisher, blah, 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 all that stuff that he was for the first 11 weeks that he was with the Bills before the injury. I think you just kind of the further away you get from the injury, like it's better. The injury's healing up better, but he's also getting older. And I think this is the most interesting conversation for the Bills at this position outside of, what kind of additions can we make? Can we make that huge swing for Myles Garrett, and what that looks like for the rest of the room. And I think Von Miller's future with the team is very dependent on whether or not they're able to accomplish that big home run hit. And you know, if you're going after Myles Garrett and you're able to get him, like, yeah, it's a lot easier to say goodbye to Von Miller. You know, mentioned Max Crosby earlier. He was like my 1B target for this position group, and he's not going anywhere now. Trey Hendrickson is another player I was, my very clearly my number 2 after Myles Garrett and Max Crosby in this situation. But a player that I'd definitely be down to make a phone call about trading for, as he's kind of dealing with his contract with Cincinnati. Well, today Sam Hubbard, playing opposite him, announced his retirement. So is Cincinnati more likely to try to hold on to Hendrickson now? There's just a lot of factors in play. But the big thing for me is just the price tag that Von is currently playing with, something like a $17 million cap hit this year. And you can release him and get a bunch of cap savings. So, obviously we know Von Miller did, basically a pay cut last year and was offered actually more than what his original contract was worth in incentives if he hit them all. Is that something that you can get him to do 2 years in a row? I don't know. I know Von Miller's been vocal about wanting to be a general manager when he retires. Is that something that, is in the back of his head, like, boy, when I'm a general manager, I sure hope somebody does this for me so we can make things work. I don't know. There's a lot of pieces in play there. But what I do know is the production that you got from Von Miller last year, the percentage of snaps that he was on the field for, he's basically a situational pass rusher at this juncture. And it's not to say that he wasn't good in the run game last year. He was. Probably one of his better seasons in the run game in recent history. But as far as, sniffing $20 million, that's you're talking damn near Groot extension money, and you're talking about, an ascending, I think Groot's 25-year-old versus a very clearly on the decline mid-30s guy. It's a very different scale there, and I'm not opposed to Von Miller being back on if we're able to get, some cap relief from him. But to me, that value has to make sense of, hey, we could cut you and save X amount of dollars. We need to get that cap savings, and we're glad to have you back. And if you can't get to that point, I think it's just time to move on. And that's just something that we'll have to see how it plays out. I know it was like Brandon Beane said something about, they're talking about it. I've seen reports that it's like, a 50-50 chance that he comes back. If he's back, I'm not going to be terribly upset about it. Again, with the caveat that they did something with the contract that it makes sense for both teams there. Guys that are free agents from the Bills that were on the team last year, Casey Toohill and DeJuan Smoot. And I don't really see a path for both of these guys coming back. Maybe one, maybe the other. I think Smoot has a much better chance of coming back. I thought he was overall pretty effective in his limited snap role. Is it somebody that I'm dying to bring back? No. Again, kind of similar to the Epinesa conversation here for me, that like I'm good with him being a rotation guy. I'm good with him, rounding out the room. Again, this is not an answer to the need that exists on this team. I think between these two positions, they're very easily the top two needs on not just this defense, but the team. And we've seen the Bills have a ton of success. And, what happens? We get to the playoffs. We're playing an elite quarterback. We're playing, Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow. And we're just not able to get after them enough. And they stand back there and they pick us apart. And to me, the biggest answer there is, you know, a really rock solid defensive tackle that can help bring the pressure right up the middle. We've seen it for ages. The hardest thing for quarterbacks to overcome is that pressure right in their face. I think you can accomplish that in more than one way. I think if you have really good edges on both sides, it makes the, pass rush up the middle easier. Makes a guy like Ed Oliver more effective. And kind of vice versa. If you have really good D tackles, it makes the edge job earlier. For me, what I'd really like to see is the biggest investments made by the Bills in this offseason be at those two groups. And that can come in any one of the avenues. It could be free agency, it could be draft, it could be, a big blockbuster trade. But, the name DK Metcalf requesting a trade today. Like, do I see that and immediately think about Josh Allen and DK Metcalf playing together and what that could look like? Absolutely. Like, offense is fun. It's sexy. You're scoring points, blah, blah, blah. That would be so far third priority for me, after defensive tackle, after you address the edge. You figure out you still got money and you can make it happen, sure. But, and it's not a situation in football where you always have to choose one or the other. There is limited resources and you have to choose where you're making your big investments. So would I love a guy like DK Metcalf on the team? Absolutely. Am I on board to use, the assets that would be involved in a Myles Garrett trade to do it? Absolutely not. So to me, I think we've seen, as recently as Philadelphia in the playoffs, football games are still won and lost in the trenches. Like, it doesn't matter how good your quarterback is, if he's getting smacked every play. And, on the other side of that, it doesn't matter how good the back end of your defense is. It doesn't matter how many points your offense can score. If you can't affect their quarterback and you run into these elite guys in the playoffs, you're going to have a problem. And I also kind of want to throw it out there because Philly's the talk of the town right now, and rightfully so. Their defensive front absolutely got after Mahomes and made him have a bad day. And when you look at the talent that they assembled on their defensive line, they have a lot of good to great players. But when you're talking about that, marquee big name, Myles Garrett, when you're talking that level player, they don't have that dude. What they do have is like 8 good players that they were able to just throw waves at the quarterback. And that's another way that the team can address this. It doesn't have to be these huge swings going for a home run with a Myles Garrett, with a Hendrickson. You can bring in, a committee. The Buffalo Bills love to rotate their defensive linemen. You can have 6, 7, 8 guys that are going to get a good amount of snaps. That's another way to address this. And we'll get into that more as we move into free agency and see what's happening. I don't know which way this approach is going to go. It's real easy to sit here and say, take that swing for Myles Garrett, but I don't have to be the one to sign off on sending away multiple picks, first round picks, whatever. So more than one way to address the situation, and we won't have to wait too long to see kind of how we feel the plan's shaken out, because whether or not the Bills are starting to make moves as soon as the legal tampering starts, you might see the Bills make their first move and insert name here, be like a rotation defensive tackle that doesn't really move the meter for you too much. Like I said, we got to see how this all plays out, kind of make our judgment on all the moves that were made as we get into like August and training camps. But as of right now, we have like 6 months before the Bills are hitting the field. A lot of time for Brandon Beane to tool with the roster. So we'll see how it all shakes out. Like I said, Monday starts the legal tampering period. So by the time you hear from me next, maybe some action's going on. Plan is still to finish up the review series. Had kind of a little bit of a delay in there. We don't have much left to go through. So as any news comes in, we're still going to finish up that series and, talk about any moves that happen as they come. Do have a special extra episode lined up for you if you tuned in last week. We're supposed to get that done on Sunday, but had some scheduling things come up with the surprise guest. So we've rescheduled that to this coming Sunday. So good time to hit that subscribe button. Make sure you're not missing that bonus episode. Make sure you're checking out the website. We have articles coming up more and more frequently. We got a couple guys involved in the process. We got some draft previews coming out for at least our perceived biggest areas of need. Diving into some of the prospects. A lot of good stuff happening. Check out the merch over there. Pumping out content. We're trying to get as much out to you as we can. So always appreciate it if you do us the honor of liking it, sharing it, drop a comment, let us know what you're thinking. Like I said, if you think everything I said is stupid and you want to tell me that, let's start a discussion. Drop a comment. If you love what I said, love to hear that too. But do all the things for us. Like, share, subscribe. Helps us out a ton to bring out these episodes every week. That's going to do it for this week's episode. Like I said, next week we're going to continue with the defensive positional review series. And hey, hopefully we got some really cool news to talk about as the legal tampering period opens up. But until then, and as always, go Bills. See you next week.